Getting ready to watch a video.
Really? What?
Oh, just some scary movie.
You like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
What's your favorite scary movie?
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Here's Johnny.
The act of scaring others is one of the oldest art forms. What makes horror stand out above any other genre of art is its ability to invoke the raw, primal emotion of fear. As fear has driven us to evolve, it has evolved with us. Horror movies have always been made by and for outcasts. People whose stories are ignored will always gravitate to the genre that celebrates the harsh realities we face far more than any other art form. Personally, growing up in an immigrant household, I never really saw movies that told my story or had people that looked like me. It wasn't until I watched the Nightmare on Elm Street remake with my dad that I was introduced to the wonderful world of horror and its surprising diversity. Movies as we know them began with the invention of moving pictures, as any fan of Jordan Peele's Nope would know.
Did you know that the very first assembly of photographs in sequential order to create a motion picture was a 2-second clip of a black man on a horse? Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Look it up.
Some of the earliest movies were of basic things seen in everyday life. Two people talking, a train departing its station. But as the technology behind these pictures developed, so did their storytelling capabilities. Artists realized they could tell short stories that reflected the world around them and express them through their own little world on screen. As narrative films were born, horror soon followed. The first ever horror film released, Georges Méliès's Le Manoir du Diable, or The House of the Devil, came out in 1896, only a few years after the first movies were made. During World War I, filmmaking came to a standstill, but the war continued to impact European and American audiences long after it had ended. The start of the 1920s saw the brutal realities of war hit the big screen. Films like The Phantom of the Opera and The Hunchback of Notre Dame hit American theaters with foreign tales of classic horror that featured disfigured and dismembered villains who were shunned by those around them, just like the soldiers who returned home with missing limbs and battle scars. These films were the earliest examples of horror movies directly being affected by and displaying a relevant social issue. While the other silent films of this era showed happy romantic views of the war and post-war era, horror was there to show audiences the ugly truth of what their patriotism got them. Moving into the 1930s, the Great Depression overtook the minds of the American people. Here is where we see the big boom in horror films, still described as dark melodramas. Films such as Dracula and The Invisible Man took European literature and shared them with an American audience, and it was James Whale's picture Frankenstein that definitely took the cake. The painted sets of medieval castles and gloomy graveyards provided a perfect distraction to the struggles Americans were facing. Whale was gay and a European immigrant, a prime target during the Depression. He took Mary Shelley's classic tale and made it his own, sharing his experience as an out gay man in Hollywood during a time where his identity was blamed for the nation's hardship. Films of the 1940s were mainly propaganda or war movies, and the horror movies of this era were no different. The massive success of the Universal Monsters franchise led to films like The Invisible Agent, where the Universal Monsters joined the war effort. The pre- and post-war era also saw a rise in stylistic, shadowy noir films, which would influence the horror movies of this time. Cat People in particular was one of the first movies to explore feminine sexuality and rage, while still playing on the European horror motifs of the 30s.
I've been followed by something that was not human, something that attempted to take my life. I believe that was the cat form of Irena.
Why should she wish to harm you?
Because I'm in love with her husband.
Cat People followed a Serbian immigrant's romantic relationship with an American man. The film used a werewolf story to describe the pain and envy felt by women in unfaithful relationships and the alienation felt by immigrants. The consistent use of shadows and dark spaces contrasted the cultural differences between a European immigrant and her American fiancé. Cat People's success paved the way for more films to explore the feminine side of horror, a topic that would be further explored in the 60s with the rise of second-wave feminism. The 40s also saw a rise in black-made independent horror films, led by director Spencer Williams. Williams' films directly depicted the typical black middle-class family. Although his movies were relatively unknown and not commercially successful, they provided a normal sense of black culture during a time where minorities were only present in cinema as servants or caricatures. In the 50s, horror movies began to display the political landscape of the time much more overtly. The rise of communism and the beginning of the space race inspired horror films to adapt more scientific plots, such as in The Thing and Them. Also during this time, the fear of communist takeover replaced the monsters and foreign entities of before. The popularity of the sci-fi genre, coupled with the housewife culture of the time, meant that the mystical femininity of the 40s horror noir films were gone. However, women still found a place in these schlocky creature features. While most women played a sexualized damsel in distress role, popular horror sci-fi such as The Creature from the Black Lagoon depicted women as scientists and doctors.
Could it possibly belong to a Pleistocene man?
The chances are much greater that that hand belonged to an amphibian, Mark. One that spent a great deal of time in the water.
Well, then how do you account for the structure of the fingers? Obviously for land use. What do you think, Dr. Matos?
They were still damsels and they were still very much in distress, but it was a step in the right direction for showing what women could be beyond these stereotypes. The 1960s ushered in an era of rampant and radical change, and the scary movies of this era reflected this while also inspiring their own change. The decade started off with a bang, with Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, a scandalously violent and lewd film about a killer crossdresser. The protagonist of the film, Marion Crane, broke stereotypes by being a headstrong character with questionable morality. She was feisty and outspoken, and she completely subverted the expectations of what female characters should be in film. Even more radical was the film's antagonist, Norman Bates. This loud portrayal of mental illness was unheard of in Hollywood, and his cross-dressing and misdiagnosis as transsexual ignited conversations about gender identity and queerness in film.
Why was he dressed like that?
He's a transvestite.
Not exactly.
The emergence of second-wave feminism meant that female fears of domesticity and misogyny became more understood in media, especially in horror. 1968's Rosemary's Baby captured these fears and exposed them to a wide audience.
What have you done to it? What have you done to its eyes?
Maybe the most influential film of this time was Night of the Living Dead. The film starred black theater actor Dwayne Jones as a leader during a zombie apocalypse and left shockwaves across the entire film industry. For one, the film was excessively gruesome, more so than any mainstream flick at the time. Night of the Living Dead was also released mere months after Martin Luther King was assassinated, so audiences resonated with the strong and peaceful figure of Ben in the film, especially since he was not afraid to stand up to the white people who endangered his group of survivors. This makes his death at the hands of a white mob all the more impactful, even if director George A. Romero never intended it to be.
Good shot. Okay, he's dead. Let's go get him. That's another one for the fire.
The 70s brought in a new genre of horror, the slasher film.
Leave me alone! Jill, this is Sergeant Sacker. Listen to me. We've traced the call. It's coming from inside the house.
Slashers are characterized by a killer or killers hunting young people who usually invade the killer's space, and the young adults are killed off one by one until the survivor, always a girl, is left to kill the threat herself. Although many think of slashers and imagine a masked maniac chopping up naked teens at a slumber party, the genre originally started as a sort of protest against the conservative politics of 1970s America. Displaying violence and nudity on screen without censorship was a big FU to the US government, and the main protagonists of these films were young hippie teens who represented the emerging counterculture of this time. Notably, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is quite literally a battle between young hippies and old-fashioned Southern Americans who faced rampant unemployment, an obvious commentary on the culture wars that were happening during this time.
That gun's no good. I was in there once with my uncle. No way. With a sledge. See, that was better. They died better that way. How come? I thought the gun was better.
Oh, no. With the new way people put out of jobs.
You do that?
1973's Black Christmas is another example, a holiday horror film featuring a central conflict where the main character, Jessica, is planning an abortion.
Do you remember when we first met? You told me about your wanting to be a concert pianist, how it was your greatest dream. And I told you about some of the things that I wanted to do. I still want to do those things. You can't ask me to drop everything I've been working for and give up all my ambitions because your plans have changed. Be realistic.
The relationship between her boyfriend's oppressive attitude against her decision and her harassment at the hands of an unknown killer gave a clear opinion on the relationship between men and women in a post-Roe v. Wade era. This type of commentary could only be found in these low-budget slasher flicks. The 70s also saw the rise of the black indie scene in film, thanks to the blaxploitation genre. Following the civil rights movement and the expansion of minority representation in media, black filmmakers found their voice in low-budget action thrillers that, like slashers, featured black actors as violent anti-heroes who took justice into their own hands, an obvious response to the injustices black people faced throughout American history. This led to a boom in black-centered horror movies, most notably 1971's Blackula, which were surprisingly successful among the new niche audience horror films had gathered. These movies allowed black filmmakers to have their voices heard in an industry that had always ignored them, and these cheesy flicks paved the way for minority filmmakers to come. The 80s are considered the golden age of horror, and for good reason. Slasher icons such as Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger had overtaken all aspects of pop culture, and horror films had finally become mainstream. As such, all the stories and voices of these outcast minorities were on full display for the world to see. These slasher films often had minorities as integral characters, even if they would not often survive to the end of the film. The final girl trope is popularized now. Final girls are the last women standing, and they're often quiet, shy, and nerdy girls that stand out from their more promiscuous friends.
As usual, I have nothing to do.
It's your own fault, and I don't feel a bit sorry for you.
This trope allowed women to be fleshed out characters who also doubled as complete badasses, like Ripley from the Alien franchise, or Laurie Strode in Halloween. In the 1980s, there was also a rise in homoerotic themes in horror films, partly due to the horror writer Clive Barker's influence on the genre, and partly due to the counterculture from the 70s still having resonance in a Reagan America. Nightmare on Elm Street 2, for example, was a horror film featuring a pop culture icon who is in a homoerotic relationship with the final guy Jesse. Mark Patton, who plays Jesse, was also in the closet during this time. Horror films have always been a safe haven for queerness, and the 80s allowed this queerness to develop into a new art form within horror that was unattainable in any other genre of film. The 1990s saw the end of the slasher era while still expanding on the trends we saw in the 80s. 1991's Candyman, based on a novel by queer author Clive Barker, is a supernatural love story between a grad student and the ghost of a slave who haunts the projects of Chicago.
Be my victim. Be my victim.
Candyman was also one of the first horror films to feature a black antagonist who also had a sympathetic backstory. But what made it stand out in an era of cheap cash grabs was the interracial relationship between Helen and Candyman. Showing the complexity of interracial relationships was one thing, but to display it with the commentary on urban struggles and slavery brought attention to black trauma. It wasn't until 1996's Scream where self-referential humor took the forefront of horror. Scream was a massive success that revitalized the horror genre and introduced it to a new generation, but Scream 2 was the first horror film to directly tackle the relationship between race and slashers.
About some
dumbass white girls getting their white asses cut the fuck up, okay?
Yeah, I suppose Sandra Bullock is Miss Ethnicity, right?
Well, no, all I'm saying is that the horror genre is historical for excluding the African-American element.
I like how you get your PhD in black cinema, sister.
Future films followed this by directly subverting common horror tropes, such as the black guy always dying first, moving horror away from its reputation as a dumb fun genre. The post 9/11 era continued to increase minority representation, especially in slashers, but the constant talk of war and violence meant that audiences were looking for an escape. Here, the torture porn subgenre was born, where horror films largely abandoned the social intricacies of the past in favor of even more blood and guts. This is a direct result and continuation of the response to conservative governments in the 70s and the 80s. The 2010s saw another rise in socially conscious horror as a result of the rise in social movements such as the Black Lives Matter and Me Too movements. In turn, these films helped raise awareness to these movements and encourage audiences to be socially conscious as well, just like they've always done. These movies didn't reach the mainstream until Jordan Peele's groundbreaking directorial debut, Get Out. Released in 2017, Get Out showed the world what horror fans always knew. Horror movies were the perfect medium for exploring social issues and uplifting those who experience these issues. Get Out, a film about a rich white cult invading the minds of black people for their physical traits, was one of the biggest films of that year, and it exposed a wide audience to the social perils black Americans face every day, and the horror behind it. Thanks to Get Out, social horror became widely recognized, and the genre's relevance to telling these stories was at the forefront of conversations everywhere.
No.
Today, films and media have become the most diverse they have ever been, and the progress would not be possible without horror. Scary movies have been at the head of all these different social and political movements over the years, and these films helped influence these movements across an ever-growing audience. Horror is a genre for outcasts, and that is why it has been and will continue to be the most integral genre for keeping minority voices alive.